Welcome to those who are just arriving now. My name is Larry Chang, and with Steph Barral, Lois Eldred, Melissa Davey-Rothwell, I help direct the Hopkins CFAR Implementation Science Scientific Working Group. So this is actually our 5th annual HIV Implementation Science Symposium, which is pretty amazing. I just want to give you a little bit of background about the Implementation Science Scientific Working Group. So we're part of the CFAR, and what we're trying to do here is to help the Hopkins CFAR community and the local community in Mid-Atlantic as well with improving their implementation science knowledge and skills, and with a really strong focus on improving NIH grant writing, which of course is one of the key things that CFAR is trying to achieve. And the other thing we're trying to really do is to build upon and leverage inter-CFAR collaborations. And I think that's what's going to be great about this symposium today, is because we have a really rich group of folks from a lot of different CFARs who are going to share their experiences and their knowledge about implementation science. Before I go any further, I just want to also really just give a clap out to Jakia Jones, Eileen Martin, Kristen Hunt, and others for helping organize this. They may not hear us, but it is Anne. So it's recorded, so they can play that back whenever they're feeling a little like they need to pick me up. So I just wanted to let you know about other opportunities besides the symposium. We have a listserv, which we would invite you all to join. We do reviews of implementation science-related grants if you want some additional input prior to submission. There's a variety of CFAR awards, including a new kind of mini grant program of kind of $5,000 to maybe get things started related to implementation science. We have an online toolkit, which I'd invite you to take a look at. If anybody's interested, we've had regular research in progress meetings where we convene kind of smaller groups to discuss kind of ongoing research or research ideas. And more specifically, once you're ready to kind of coalesce things into a specific aims page, we're happy to have what we are known as specific aims lightning rounds to provide varied input on your specific aims, which have proved quite popular in the past. So if you have any questions about that, if you want to join our listserv, please email Jakia Jones, who helps coordinate the scientific working group. So this is supposed to be an interactive symposium. I think we've had some great questions before, and hopefully the format will be conducive to that. So please do ask questions. But without any further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, which is Elvin Gang. Elvin is an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. His research looks at the lens of implementation science to understand and optimize the uptake of clinically efficacious interventions for HIV, primarily in resource-limited settings. He has projects spanning engagement in care, retention in care, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and he's also an HIV clinician at San Francisco General Hospital. He's really a thought leader in HIV implementation science, so it's a real pleasure to have him here. Thanks, Elvin.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be here and a real treat to see some familiar faces and meet some new folks. I was just grabbing some lunch upstairs and always amazed by the size of the public health enterprise here, where from the village out in San Francisco. But anyway, so the talk today is called Cooking Up Some Implementation Science. Some of you have heard some of this before. I'm recycling part of this, but there is a little bit of new content, so I hope it's not too boring. So I think that the sort of argument that I want to put forth, and please feel free to interrupt at any point here, is that implementation science is about this balance between rigor and relevance. And optimizing relevance in academic research is a big problem, but it's not the topic for today. On the other hand, analyses from real-world clinic-based or administrative sources are often very relevant and representative, but they may require some strategies to enhance rigor. And that might include novel counterfactual-based approaches or targeted supplementation. I'm going to use examples from my group in HIV research, not because it's good, but because it's accessible, and argue that the value of research using data from programmatic sources has been probably overlooked or undervalued by the field. So let me start with this heuristic that we took from some engineers originally, but it puts research in this sort of this four cell quadrant. And on the y-axis is rigor, and on the x-axis is relevance in routine practice settings. So implementation science wants to be in the top right corner, but research that's neither rigorous nor relevant is they call puerile. Research that's highly rigorous but not relevant is pedantic. Research that is very relevant but not rigorous is populist. And finally, sort of the quadrant we want to be in is the top right, pragmatic, both rigorous and relevant. So let me motivate this with a case presentation, but this is not going to be the kind of case presentation I think you're used to. This is taken from my life, and others may recognize this scenario, but it's 5:30 p.m. You're rushing out of work mid-email to pick up your child 1 minute before the school closes at 5:59. You know that if you arrive, you will be charged $5 for each minute you are late after that, so you're in a hurry. You arrive home with your hungry child at about 6:25. Your hungry spouse is on the way home, and she sends you, in this case, a text message. What's for dinner? So I do most of the cooking in my household, so at that point, I'm faced with the dilemma. Should I go to Whole Foods and pick up some ingredients for a very nice dinner, or should I examine what's in the fridge and do what I can with what I have? So I open up the fridge, and this is stolen from Google Images. My fridge looks quite a bit worse than that, but so research is like dinner. There are advantages to using what you have. First of all, there is some urgency. Do you go out and get data, or do you use the data you already have? Okay, you want to save money. If you don't use what you have, it's going to get old soon. So you might as well try to cook something up with it. But what you have might not be exactly what the recipe calls for. And so the question is, can we eat what we want using what we already have? So what are the recipes for rigor? You've often heard this phrase, garbage in, garbage out, and a lot of folks use this to write off essentially all administrative data. But when we get down to the heart of it, I think causal inference is the central tenet of rigor. And so we perhaps can't categorize these data categorically, but rather think about what can we do to enhance counterfactual-based approaches using these types of data. And I would go maybe a step further and make the argument that randomized trials are not the only recipe for rigor. When I was in medical school, I remember being told point blank, only randomized trials can give you causality. So I think sort of a more modern approach to this suggests that that's not true, but you do need some assumptions. There's many things you can't randomize. And also, traditionally, RCTs anyway, control the context to some extent. But what we really want in implementation science are effects in context. So what are some of these alternative recipes for rigor? So there's a whole suite of causal inference techniques. There's propensity scores, there's inverse probability weights, et cetera, and other things. But one thing that's not on this list, and which I think isn't high up in the recipe book in public health, but perhaps could be, are natural experiments. So this is recipe one for using what's in the fridge. So in this approach, basically you look for a condition or exposure that's not under the control of researchers, but is plausibly randomly assigned. And you can use these to learn about causal effects in real world settings. So I think John Snow's original work about cholera in London is perhaps the first and quintessential example of a natural experiment. He was able to, he realized that the water supply in these neighborhoods was essentially offered by sort of randomly by two companies, yet only the people who were supplied by one company got a lot of cholera and folks in the other company didn't. And so he surmised that it was the water. So a more recent example, which I'd like to just point out briefly, which I think gave rise to a lot of subsequent work in this area, was done by some folks at UCSF in 1986, in which they sought to assess the effect of eligibility for the draft into the Vietnam War on health outcomes. So between 1970 and 72, 20-year-old men in the United States were randomly assigned to be eligible for the draft. So the process was not under the control of any researchers, but it was as if randomized. these populations should therefore be exchangeable and offer a strong opportunity to look at a counterfactual. And so differences in the outcomes represent the effect of eligibility for the draft. So these results were published in the New England Journal in 1986. And basically, overall, if you compare people who were eligible for the draft, and this isn't even people who served to preserve the effects of randomization or as if randomization, there were statistically significant increases in subsequent suicide and motor vehicle accident when looking at the populations of California, Pennsylvania, and a significant difference in sort of all-cause mortality. And the authors felt this provided strong evidence that the effects of being eligible for combat or for the Vietnam War had long-term health effects. So there are a number of flavors of natural experiments, but one particular one is a regression discontinuity. And this takes advantage of a practice or an activity that is assigned at an arbitrary threshold for some continuous characteristic. And the idea is that people on either side of this continuous characteristic are exchangeable. So it's not fully random, but as if. And the canonical example of this is it is an original study done in 1960, which sought to ask the question of, if you give a child a reward or an award for scholastic achievement, does it help them achieve more in the future? Is that encouragement? Does that have a lasting effect? And so in this experiment, they took test results, and if you score above, say, 85 on a test result, you get an award. Below 85, you don't. But they hypothesized that sort of the people just above 85, like 86, 87, and just below 83, 84 are really not that different. I mean, you're sort of 1 or 2 points off, which might just be due to what you had for breakfast that day rather than how well you actually know the topic. And so they compared how they did subsequently and found that there was some effect of getting an award. So another well-known example recently is from China. There's a policy that prohibits certain types of heating below a river, and above a river there you can use sort of coal-based heating. And the authors wanted to look at the effect of that on air pollution on mortality, and use this as an opportunity to examine that effect, which they found. But it's sort of a controversial paper, but was in PNAS nevertheless. And I think these approaches have probably not been fully utilized in health and public health research. So here I want to talk a little bit about a study that was recently done by Alok Modi, who's a fellow at UCSF in infectious diseases, and wanted to examine the effect of treatment expansion on retention. So we know that offering treatment to all persons living with HIV improves clinical outcomes. But the randomized trials that were done to document these clinical outcomes also imposed a particular trial environment on the patients. And so questions remained about whether or not the effects of such a policy change in the real world, whether it would have an effect on things, on the behaviors such as ART start, retention, loss to follow-up and routine care, and could there be unintended consequences? So Alok used a policy change in Zambia in 2014 to try and foreshadow what the ongoing policy change would be presently. In 2014, Zambia changed the threshold for treatment from 350 to 500, and presently there's people are expanded to treat all. And so he looked at people who presented just before and after the guideline change, and made an assumption that those people who presented shortly before and after were otherwise exchangeable, and therefore their outcomes might be indicative of the effect of this policy. This is a slide that snuck in here. Let me see if I have the other ones. There we go. Okay, so this is among about 30,000 patients in 64 clinics. And this is looking at an outcome of retention, and we can get into the nuances of how retention is measured, but basically what he found was that before and after the April threshold, retention in the entire population of patients increased slightly by about 4%, and this is statistically significant. Among newly eligible patients, that is the group of people who presented with a CD4 count between 350 and 500, there was a 13% increase in retention. And among people who were always eligible, meaning they had a CD4 count of less than 350, there was no change in retention, suggesting that there was no crowding out effect. Like putting new patients on treatment didn't mean that the patients who are already eligible fared any worse. Based on this, the conclusion was that further expansion of treatment is likely to improve both retention and not have effects crowding out. Now, one could ask, sort of, in some ways, are studies like this better than an RCT? They could be considered more relevant because they incorporate or they examine sort of important health systems and behavioral effects. Could it be as rigorous? I think these do come with assumptions, and those assumptions can and should be carefully interrogated. But at the end of the day, they probably are asking different questions and complement the results of randomized trials. Now, before I move on from the natural experiment thing, it is worth saying, of course, there is no free lunch, no completely free lunch. So if you're looking for a natural experiment, you have to settle for a question that is closest to the question that you originally wanted to ask, right? Because the natural experiments sort of happen naturally, not totally under your control. And you have to ask yourself, how valuable is the question that I'm answering? So before and after guidelines from 350 to 500, does that actually foreshadow the effect of going from 500 to no threshold at a different calendar time? It could be that it does, but there are many reasons that it might not. Jacob Bohr also published a very nice paper addressing this question from a slightly different angle, which was he looked at, during a period of time when the CD4 thresholds were 350, he looked at people just above and just below the 350 threshold to surmise the effect of eligibility on retention. Is the local effect across a threshold of 350 applicable to 500, 600, 700? We don't exactly know, but so you do sort of give up something when you get some free lunch. So so back to the case presentation. So now that you've gotten that text message, 2 minutes later, you're rummaging through the refrigerator, and in the fridge there is chicken, there is broth, oops, this is a typo. There is scallions, there is cilantro, and anise. This is perfect for Vietnamese noodle soup, but there's no noodles. So sorry, there's that. This is a bad typo. So you're missing noodles. Otherwise, you've got everything else. So, and then in this case, my wife sends me a message, your mom is coming, so you can't mess this up. Recipe 2 is using mostly what's in the fridge and going to the corner bodega. So instead of going to Whole Foods, maybe you have most of what you need in the fridge, but you're missing a key ingredient. And you can just step outside if you live in New York City, and maybe on the corner there's a bodega, and you can grab a couple of things there. You're not going to get everything that you need, but you might be able to rustle up some noodles. So I think targeted additional measurements that leverage and magnify the value of material that we already have is another strategy in implementation science that I think we need to think more about. So you can mess around in the kitchen and try to find a substitute or a workaround, but at some point, after a lot of additional effort, you're just going to have to decide at some point that maybe there is that other thing that you do need. So if you're missing the noodles, you can think, well, what if I serve it with bread? Maybe I'll make rice, but it's just not the same. It's not going to be noodle soup. There's no way around that. But on the other hand, this still does it is still inefficient and it is still efficient and inexpensive compared to perhaps the whole shebang of going to Whole Foods and getting everything from scratch. So I wanted to use some of the work that we've done about loss to follow-up from global HIV clinic-based cohorts to illustrate this point. So most of you know of the International Epidemiologic Databases to Evaluate AIDS. It's NIH funded. Many of you in this room probably work in IDEA. And it pools clinic-based data from sort of Eastern, Western, Southern Africa, as well as North America, South America, and Asia. And if I'm not mistaken, the North American version of IDEA, which is NA Accord, I think has something like 1 in 3 patients in the whole country in the cohorts. So these are large and representative cohorts, and therefore they're very good for understanding the effects of implementation, delivery, and effectiveness in real-world settings, right? This is a clinical form taken from Uganda from around 2012, 2013. It may have evolved since then. It doesn't have everything, but it has a fair amount of really useful information in it. So, there are things like what your ART regimen is, when you changed, when you substituted, and there's longitudinal information, when your visits are, when your appointments are, what your drugs were, and if you missed your appointments and stuff like that is going to be evident on these forms. So you have a relatively rich resource here. There's just one problem, at least from our perspective at the time. You have a lot of loss to follow-up. You have a lot of patients with unknown outcomes. And this is the individual cohorts taken from, this is not from IDEA, but from one of Sidney Rosen's early meta-analyses on this issue. The red just shows the proportion of patients in these cohorts that are lost to follow-up. So it's relatively sizable, 10, 15, 20, 30% frequently, and in particular vis-a-vis the number of people that you have documented who have died, it could change things a lot. So I think the question, the sort of epidemiologic question about these data are, is the experience of those people after dropping out the same as it is for those who continue to be observed? If the answer to that question is no, then first of all, your descriptive estimates could be wrong. The absolute occurrence of retention mortality. Your analytic estimates could be wrong. You have informative censoring leads to, in some cases, spurious associations and missed effects. So that your sort of regressions will give potentially the wrong answers. Looking at site-to-site heterogeneity becomes a problem because it's more of an artifact of what you know than what's really happening at the sites. And so if you take a sort of a pessimistic look at this, basically you're left with a cross-sectional analysis of patient characteristics at entry. That's like noodles. That's like chicken noodle soup without the noodles, and because you could do so much more with it. So there are strategies to manage sort of high unknown outcomes. So one, pretend it's not a problem. Use loss to follow-up itself as an outcome. And then there are analytic things you can do to try to deal with this sort of informative censoring, right? You can do standard adjustment based on patient characteristics. You can do time-updated measurements and do inverse probability censoring weights. There's lots of techniques here, but the further you delve into this, the further down this rabbit hole you go, the sort of less transparent and the more assumptions you're putting into the pot. So we... This is some work that I did with Maya Peterson years ago, where we tried to take a structural approach to understanding the nature of the loss to follow-up problem. And here I'm going to veer a little bit into the DAG world, and I apologize if this is wide of the mark here. But as most of you know, directed acyclic graphs are a way to qualitatively encode what you expect from analyses given a set of hypothetical causal assumptions. Basically in a DAG world, you have words, which are nodes, which represents influences or factors, and you have arrows, and an arrow represents a causal effect. And in the sort of semiotics of DAGs, if you have any directed path of arrows, it gives you a series of causal relationships for which you expect a statistical association. Two nodes that are connected by paths that come out of a common cause of both those nodes also give you an association, but it's a confounded association. And then finally, any pathway between two nodes that's connected by a common effect, which is two arrows going into one, it generally you expect there to be no statistical association unless you condition or adjust on that common effect. And that gives you a spurious association known as collider bias. So given what we knew about vital status, sex, and loss to follow-up in African cohorts, we could say that if we wanted to ask the question about whether or not sex had an effect on vital status, we would have to contend with the fact that sex has an effect on follow-up, because we know that men follow up sort of more poorly than women. We also know that vital status itself has a direct effect on follow-up, because in clinic-based cohorts, the researchers are not going out to make measurements. The patients come to clinic, and obviously having died is a good and common reason for not coming back anymore. So there's an effect there. So if you condition your analyses on the patients that you observe, which means putting a box essentially in DAG language around follow-up, you create collider bias. So you would expect a spurious association between sex and vital status in a statistical analysis. Now you can try to do things like adjust for pre-therapy CD4. You know that sex has an effect on pre-therapy CD4. You know that has an effect on vital status. But you can see that even if you condition on that, you're not going to close this pathway between sex and vital status. You can get more fancy and look at the effect of sex on time-updated characteristics like CD4 count and clinic visit, which we know from outside scientific information that those relationships exist. But even if, and those relationships do mediate effects on both follow-up and vital status. But even if you adjust for those things using inverse probability of censoring weights and things like that, this pathway between sex and vital status through follow-up in red remains. So our approach to this was to kind of take this sampling-based solution. So I've shown this slide many times, so I apologize to people if this is, I'm doing reruns here. But at any rate, if you look at all patients in a health unit, some get lost to follow-up. If you can identify a random sample of those who are lost to follow-up and you can trace them, most of them or a large percentage of them, then you can use those results in epidemiologic analyses with probability weights to essentially fill in the blanks and get the most out of the patients that weren't lost to begin with. This is, let's see if this works. This is some video that this is from when I was a fellow. This is like a long time ago now. This is looking for patients who are lost. And this kind of process is, you can see it takes some time and some energy, but at the end of the day, I think it's our argument that this is how we get out of our bind with missing outcomes. So we applied this more recently with Charles Holmes and the group at CIDRS, the folks Laura and Cherie and others here work with, and this is what we found using a starting cohort of 165,000 patients. The green is what the program knew about mortality, and the orange is what we found mortality to be after the tracing. So 40,000 patients out of this 160,000 were lost to follow-up, and we traced 4,000 approximately, and used those 4,000 essentially to fill in the blanks and allow us to get the most that we could out of the underlying cohort. So this is an analysis taken from an earlier study, which I think is concordant, at least, with our structural analysis of the loss to follow-up problem. This is a much smaller cohort of approximately, I think, 3,600 persons, but in the first column, you have an unweighted analysis. So this is a sort of a naive analysis using deaths before tracing, and in this analysis, we found that age and sex had age had no effect, whereas sex had a relatively large effect. We applied inverse probability of censoring weights to these and essentially found that those estimates didn't change much. You still have a qualitative answer of, sex has an effect and age has no effect or no relationship with mortality. But when we applied the sampling-based weights, we found that the qualitative inference is reversed. So age had a statistically significant effect, and sex, after using the sampling-based weights, did not. So these conclusions may not be true everywhere all the time, but in this particular case, I think that they were at least concordant with the way we were thinking about the problem with missing information. Was concordant. With the cohort in Zambia, again, just sort of, I think, some other types of inferences that we were able to get out of the data using the 4,000 sampled patients. This is among just new ART starters, and this is looking at site-to-site variation in mortality. The white bars are mortality before the exercise, and the red bars are mortality estimates after. So number one, the total amount of mortality is very different. The total spread in mortality across these clinics is very different. And the rank order of mortality at the clinics using the sort of unweighted and the weighted or the sampling-based approaches are essentially uncorrelated. Again, making the most of the data with tracing. And here's another way we used the weighted mortality data to try to understand the distribution of deaths. So this is a modified Lorenz curve, and it's in the 2018 PLOS Medicine paper as well. On the x-axis, you have cumulative proportion of the patient population. And on the y-axis, you have the excess proportion of deaths. And this is all deaths above 1% at a clinic. And each step is a clinic. So that first step represents a clinic that contains approximately 8% of the cumulative population, but represents over 20% of the total deaths in the population. And so you can see as you go from left to right that the clinics on the left side contribute disproportionately to mortality, both because the rate of mortality is higher and because those clinics contain a lot of people and therefore represent good targets for sort of improvement efforts. Recipe number 2, let me make a couple comments about this before I wrap up. So this wasn't really an implementation science question, but it's a measurement strategy that could be used for implementation interventions. And we've used similar approaches in cluster randomized trials. And a supplemental measurement in 4,000 persons allowed us to use like 165,000 observations in the way that we wanted to. So let me end with a couple of images. So what's this? Sorry. Yeah. So it's basically a cracked bowl, right? And so a lot of people might look at this and say, okay, it's a cracked bowl. It's garbage, right? You're going to throw it out. Like, what are you going to do with a cracked bowl? There's a sort of a Japanese philosophy called wabi-sabi, and I don't know if folks here have come across this, but it's an appreciation for things that are imperfect, and it's the idea that that in reality life is often imperfect, and so instead of just being disappointed and throwing away things that aren't perfect, we should think about them and appreciate them and perhaps use them. And so wabi-sabi gives rise to its own type of art form. So this is a bowl. It's been broken and it's been fixed. And it's considered more beautiful than an unbroken bowl. So in some ways, I think, let me see if in conclusion, we have tools to halt the HIV epidemic. Implementation science is most valuable when it balances rigor and relevance. So one approach to implementation science, using either what's in the fridge or mostly what's in the fridge. It's imperfect, but if treated with care and a dash of rigor, we can get stuff out of it that has a lot of external validity, that oftentimes tells us something at scale, and therefore is something that has value. So I want to thank a lot of people that I work with. I have the great privilege of working with, some of whom are in the room, and also our funders, the NIH, the Gates Foundation, and the World Health Organization. And I'll leave you with this picture. This is there's a group in Japan that makes art out of garbage, and this is one of their pieces. It's a giant fish made from junkyard materials. But so let me wrap up there, and thank you all very much.
Thanks, Elvin, for that fantastic talk. We actually have a good 10 plus minutes for questions. And staff, do you want to? So in Amsterdam, right, search came out and basically said, like, there was lots of positive outcomes, but there was no instance productive, right? ANRS study, the South African test and treat study, nothing. HPTN 071, like, not yet, but I feel like they're kind of like leading us down this path of like, don't expect much, even though, and so between those, I don't know what was spent, but $200 million, $250 million, I mean, an incredible amount of resources. So I'd love to kind of hear your perspective, right, on like, what could we learn from like those that I think people would argue are like not practical, they're beautiful, and are hard. I think they're now trying to understand like what can we learn from them as compared to like, how do we do things differently moving forward? Because I think it's interesting. I think people still feel like this stuff is on the margins, but like the stuff that's not on the margins would argue that we shouldn't treat people, or at least we shouldn't treat people at scale, or I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it means, but so I'd love to hear some perspective.
Thanks, Steph. Going straight for the jugular as usual. So I'm not an anti-randomized trial-ista. I do randomized trials. I have funding to do randomized trials, cluster randomized trials, individual level randomized trials. But I do think that we need to knock randomized trials off their pedestal, in the sense that there are lots of things that we can learn, maybe even better outside of the setting of a randomized trial. In particular, questions around implementation, right? Like, so, randomized trials don't have to do this, but when you exert control over the environment, over the context, you by definition, in addition to your intervention, you by definition are understanding the impact of an intervention in an artificial environment that is either not that far away from reality in a good case, or really far away from reality in sort of a bad case. And I'm not saying that applies necessarily to these test and treat trials, but that's I think often, maybe too often, the case. But I mean, I think that in my opinion, the questions around treating everybody. I mean, I think the clinical issue is clear, right? If you treat somebody, it's better for that human to be treated than not. So we don't need a cluster randomized trial to prove that we should treat everybody. What we do need research for is how to do so, and whether or not the best way to do that is through 5 or 50 smaller trials using implementation interventions as their primary outcomes, or one enormous trial that uses incidence as its primary outcome. I think is a question for debate. Okay, I can tell you where I come down on that debate.
Yeah.
Which is, the former.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent talk. I noticed that you put some bars up showing that there were people in, it was a bar graph of the different countries and what proportion had been transferred versus died. And there were very few transfers. In Uganda, in fact, there were no transfers in that bar graph. But we know that there's no system for actually tracking people from clinic to clinic. We don't use IDs to track people. And we think the transfers are actually probably really substantial. There's some data from South Africa showing that up to 50% of people lost to follow-up are actually just being transferred to another clinic. So can you comment on, like how you're thinking about that data? It seems to be missing from some of the artifacts that you showed.
You mean like undocumented silent transfers?
Yeah, in many of these countries, we can't even document transfers because there's no way to do it at this point. So we're not doing individual case-based
Yeah. When I realized that some of this sort of epidemiologic stuff I kind of glossed over and didn't make very clear. But so we talked about how loss to follow-up influences your descriptive outcomes. So it influences your descriptive outcomes of mortality, how much dying is going on, probably by underestimating it. But it also affects your estimates of retention. So all of your transfers are people who are still in care, but to whom your original clinic, they look like they're not in care anymore. So therefore, your retention estimates are also biased. And we've done sort of epidemiologic work looking at revised estimates of retention. But I think that is a real issue. And so when the health system definitively solves that transfer issue, then we will be in a situation where you don't have to go to Whole Foods and you don't have to look in the fridge because you'll be living in Whole Foods. So, like maybe in Denmark, you have all the information at your hands. But I think that in most situations, we're not there. We're not there in the United States. We're not there in a lot of places. And so this sort of sampling type approach is an interim solution to get information out of your clinic-based cohorts, or rather to magnify perhaps the value of information from your clinic-based cohorts. But I have a feeling that didn't totally answer your question.
No. I think it's fine. I was just sort of thinking about the fact that some of these data, a lot of these people who are lost to follow-up are probably, the majority of them are probably transfers, and that's really clearly right.
It's one just real quick comment about that. I actually think the term lost to follow probably should be banned, despite the fact that I've sort of made my career on it. The loss to follow-up implies two different things to two different audiences. So to clinical people, loss to follow-up means you're not in care anymore. To epidemiologists, it means you have an unknown outcome. And I'm using it here in the latter. I should just say people with an unknown outcome, some of which are just transferred elsewhere.
To both, it means there's been some effort to follow the patients up. Usually there is.
Good point.
Can I ask one question? Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Elvin. I'm glad I've seen this twice because there's always new things to discover in it. I wonder if you could speak to, I like the idea of using existing databases to try to learn more about them, but do you have a sense that these clinic-based cohorts, for example, are they asking implementation questions? I know you're talking about finding new ways to look at missing data to try to understand outcomes, but is it not that they're missing implementation questions, and if so, how do you, maybe you can go to the store to get those too, but I think we need to think about how to start including those so we can answer implementation questions.
Let me just say that that's a great point. So in my opinion, many of these clinic-based cohorts are still, they are still yearning to ask clinical questions when they're best positioned to ask questions about implementation, whether it's with routine data or with supplemented targeted data collection about implementation outcomes, about implementation strategies, really, even ahead of sort of implementation outcomes. But I think it's these things are a big ship and there's lots of different directions, and I think there would be others who could take counterpoint to my perspective on this, but we can and should do more with implementation.
Thank you, great talk. I think to that point, I'm at the Bartlett practice, and let's say that we implement a new policy in the practice, which I have a small study on rapid start. We really want to start making that our standard for our patients. And so we have a cohort from which we would be able to, look at the effects of this new intervention that we've done for clinical purposes. We could look at it in a more rigorous way with a cohort.
Great.
Just one more question about the RCT versus other. I'm in your camp, so I'll just say that out front. I do think that there are lots of alternatives, really good ones to RCTs. I think the thing that we sometimes struggle with in our group is like, where's the standard for rigor, right? So if we're all kind of like throwing a dash, like, do I have a heavy hand? Is my dash a little bit more than your dash? So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that. Because I think the reason we still kind of rely on RCTs is that we can reproduce it in some ways, or can try to. But if your methods and your space and your context is all off, and here's what I have, and I can't do that, can you say a little bit about how do we set a standard or assess rigor across all the studies who are doing their own thing besides RCTs?
So that is I think that's a really good question. I definitely don't have an answer. I think I can offer a few like reflections on it, but that's a great question. I think that's a question that the field of implementation science needs to take on and sort of ask ourselves, like, how much rigor do we need? And I think the answer is that it depends. There are practical reasons why you need more rigor. If you're going to go to an NIH study section, you can't give an inch. You can't give a centimeter or a millimeter in terms of rigor. Yeah. But if you want to, publish a monograph that you think you're going to influence policy, sometimes outside of like sort of academic publications, you may ask for a lower bar. And it also depends on sort of like the pre-existing beliefs about that problem. Are you supporting something? Are you providing something that's in the opposite direction of what people think? In which case you do need that rigor. But I guess I would say for me, it's like it's taking a serious crack at the counterfactual. And what a serious crack means, I think, depends. But you certainly need to have some approach where you try to get a counterfactual in some way, shape, or form. You ask yourself what the assumptions are, and you interrogate those, and then the public gets to interrogate those. But I think that's kind of like my thinking on that. But that's a great question.
I think we're out of time, but let's thank Elvin for our amazing So let me introduce our next speaker, which is Justin Dean Smith. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. He is the principal investigator of 3 effectiveness implementation hybrid trials, testing the integration of behavioral health interventions in primary care practices. He's associate director of the Center for Prevention Implementation Methodology for Drug Abuse and HIV, and a fellow of the NIH Funded Implementation Research Institute.
Great. Thank you, Larry and to Steph, for this invitation to come and share some exciting results with everybody. I want to acknowledge first and foremost my co-author, Nanette Benbow, who has been the partner in crime on this. She can share in the glory or the failure, whichever one is warranted. I'll let you guys choose. So what we tried to do here is really take a look at what the landscape of NIH-funded implementation research is. And so NIH-funded is in the title for a reason, and we'll get back to a few things that sort of relate to that as we go through. Some acknowledgements as well to our collaborators who really helped either shape this or also just did a lot of reviews of abstracts and coding for us. Everyone knows systematic and scoping reviews require a lot of hands on deck, and certainly we had a lot. And also some funding acknowledgements to different NIH centers, NIDA for our Center for Prevention and Implementation Methodology, Third Coast Center for AIDS Research at Northwestern, as well as the Implementation Research Institute that's jointly funded by NIH and NIDA. So the very specific purpose of this scoping review was really to identify the proportion as well as some of the characteristics of HIV-related implementation research that's currently funded by NIH going back to 2013. So basically the last 5 years worth of fiscal year HIV-related implementation research. So one definition that's really important is what is HIV research, right? So we define it as studies that measure an HIV outcome that's related to the prevention or care continuum indicators, which would be things like PrEP awareness, linkage, retention, adherence, HIV risk reduction. We're all pretty familiar with these. The NIH, the definition of implementation research maybe is a little bit more fuzzy, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time kind of unpacking this. We relied on the NIH definition, in part because this is NIH funded. The other being that it's one of the more commonly used as well as a bit broad definition, and we wanted to be pretty inclusive in this review as much as we could. We also included implementation preparation research, which I'm going to define as well, since that might be totally new to some people, considering we basically made it up. Here's a nice Prisma flow diagram. The big thing to really kind of look at here is we had 4,629 records. Of course, when you do reviews on NIH Reporter, you're going to get a different entry for every single year that an award is funded. So NR1 might have 5 years, also might have supplements, et cetera. So we removed all duplicates to get independent award numbers. So 4,600 awards that we were able to look at. We screened those actually using machine learning based algorithms for both keywords in HIV as well as keywords in implementation research to get 3 levels of like highly likely to be included, maybe likely you should potentially look at this, and then ones that had basically no keywords, and we could be pretty confident in excluding those without doing a human-based screening. You guys can follow this, I'm not going to go through everything, but really at the end of the day, we identified 594 total studies that we determined to be HIV related. And we also included, of course, those that had implementation research. So let's get into the definition of that.
Are those just RST?
Just NIH.
Just RST.
Oh no, it's not. So there's Ks, there's a few center grants. We did not exclude based on the award mechanism. So again, our purpose was to take an inclusive view of implementation research. And so the NIH definition, which has been the centerpiece of the D&I PAR for a number of years, as well as most RFAs in implementation research, says that it is the evaluating the use of implementation strategies to integrate interventions into real-world settings to improve patient outcomes. So the two kind of key things there is the difference between what's a strategy, what's an intervention. We'll get back to that in many ways, because that really is actually the intervention being the HIV part of this thing, and then implementation research being the evaluation of some sort of an implementation strategy, and hopefully implementation outcomes, but as you'll see, the outcomes are not necessarily following the strategy. So here's where we got into some fun discussion around what should be included, and sort of what falls outside of the strict NIH definition, but really does actually still contribute to what we're doing in implementation research. And we defined this new thing as the implementation preparation phase. I can't take credit for it. David Chambers said we should do that instead of calling it pre-implementation. After a little bit of back and forth, David won. So he was right. It's totally fine. So really, implementation preparation, we kind of found a few things within our search that I think can give you a sense of what this is. So it's research that's used only to understand implementation processes, barriers, and facilitators. So nothing else. It doesn't go beyond that. That's all we're trying to do. Preliminary research on the potential feasibility or the acceptability of a novel implementation strategy only. So they don't go into testing. They don't go into evaluation. Potentially some formative research to develop or tailor novel strategies. Again, with nothing further. This could be something you might see in an R03 or R21, preparatory research for an R01 or a fully powered trial. We also found a lot of studies that were really using just the implementation strategy of adapting an evidence-based intervention without really doing anything else. So that's an application of the strategy itself without actually evaluating its effectiveness. And we also had a number of studies, either simulation, a number of different kinds of simulations like agent-based modeling, that has the potential to inform implementation research, but is itself not actually testing in the real world in implementation strategy, right? So it can inform what we would do, but it's not actually a test. So of those 594 HIV studies that I mentioned, we found 216 that we identified as being implementation research related, and we found about 50% in both of these camps, being either kind of fitting the definition for NIH research, which would be kind of implementation phase of research, or the earlier implementation preparation. There's a lot of stuff that'll help disentangle those two things here in a second. So kind of putting this into some context of where it lies in the traditional translational pipeline, this is a figure that Hendricks Brown and a number of folks have in a paper in the Annual Review of Public Health last year. And really what we're focused on here is what's all in that purple box. So after we have an efficacious intervention, hopefully that's been tested at least once or twice in the real world in more of an effectiveness study to show that, okay, if we control this environment in a way that helps us actually determine whether this could be effective, that's great. And then the implementation practice to implementation research box up in the right-hand corner is really trying to take this to scale. So really kind of the community impact, population level impact. We highlighted here too the exploration and preparation phases that occur within implementation research to show kind of where we see this implementation preparation delineation happening. It really is sort of the stuff that leads up to a formal test of the implementation itself, but really isn't quite getting there yet. Here's some fun word clouds, because who doesn't like word clouds? This is looking at actually the titles of the grants and just the frequency of the words that you see. I'm not, you can look at this with a magnifying glass or a pair of binoculars if you have them, but you'll not see too many differences. Obviously, HIV is very front and center. Words like intervention, implementation, research, treatment, prevention are really kind of most commonly used. I show this only really to say that there are some places where we don't see many differences, but there are places where we do, and I'm going to highlight the places where we do see discrepancies as much as I can through the presentation. Looking at grant characteristics, you can see here some funding centers and institutes. Not surprisingly, NIMH, NIDA, NIAID are the biggest funders of AIDS and implementation research grants. Mechanisms, back to Chris's question, so 43% are R01s, but we do have, again, 10% K grants, and then a lot of smaller Rs, even some U cooperative agreements, of course, which are not surprising. In terms of study start dates, so we do see a slight increase, but it does become a little bit linear. So in 2013, not funding a whole lot, about 13% of our studies were in that year or started in that year. We have an increase up to 2014, and again, an increase again to 15 and 16, but then it kind of flattens out 16, 17. Don't pay attention to 2018. We stopped this, we did this review back in March. And so we really only are getting not even actually a full study section review for things that started in 2018. So we can't really say a whole lot from that yet. In terms of looking at study sections where these were reviewed, you can see that the two most common were the behavioral and social consequences of HIV/AIDS, the behavioral and social approaches to preventing HIV/AIDS, and then a ton that were reviewed in special emphasis panels. Not going to get into too much reason of why that is, but it's interesting. So primary study populations, looking at really who they were targeting, a lot of general population, a lot of women, adolescent, young adult, of course MSM, and then we see kind of going all the way down. These are not mutually exclusive populations, so you can obviously have studies of African American MSM, you can have transgendered sex workers, et cetera, as populations. Looking again at population characteristics, this is really looking at their HIV status as well. So we have, about a third of our studies are looking at positives, about a third looking at negatives, and about a quarter looking at both. And then there's a number that are not specified, so it's not totally clear from the abstract exactly what their population inclusion criteria was or the target really of their intervention. And another interesting thing, about 50% international versus 50% looking at domestic populations. If we divide those up further, in our international studies, we see a bigger focus on women than we do here in our US studies. In our US studies, we see a bigger proportion of kind of adolescent, young MSM, and MSM potentially compared to the international side, but not really too many huge differences here except for the women. I think it's the biggest one. So I'll keep moving on. We also coded where along the care continuum these trials were looking. A lot of them really were only looking at one step. And so about 59% were purely focused on prevention, a number in testing, a number in retention and re-engagement, about 20% in ART. And then there was a lot actually too, about 43% of the studies targeted more than one step within the cascade. And you can see where those kind of fall. A lot of HIV testing and linkage, a lot of retention and ART, and then we have a lot of prevention and HIV testing, prevention, HIV testing, and linkage studies. So those being the kind of the phases or time within the continuum that they're targeted. So another interesting thing is we did code for this implementation phase. Again, I mentioned the implementation preparation and implementation. And this is where the HIV interventions fall within that. I think just a couple things that are interesting to point out. PrEP being a much newer evidence-based intervention, especially over the last 5 years. You see a lot more studies using PrEP that are kind of in this implementation preparation phase, as compared to some things that maybe are considered more far along, or maybe have had previous implementation research earlier than 2013, where they're kind of getting a lot further along into the implementation. HIV counseling and testing is a good example where it's clearly moving into the implementation side. So here's some selected interventions by delivery method. I'm not going to go over this, but these are fun. I like the colors. Nanette made these. Okay, so getting into kind of the implementation characteristics, one thing that I coded for with the help of the team was what was the actual type of study along with the intent or the aim of the study. So you can see some of the examples on the right-hand side where they're really looking just at barriers and facilitators, didn't really care about anything else. Were they looking to examine the potential impact of an implementation strategy or multiple strategies? Were they developing or adapting an implementation strategy? Were they comparing implementation strategies, et cetera? So you can see there's 27% of the studies were looking at whether or not there's an impact of an implementation strategy. Those were only one. So this is a study that looks at one strategy or a couple different strategies, but doesn't compare it to something else. 21% of the studies looked purely at barriers and facilitators, nothing else. We also had 12% that did this development or adaptation of an implementation strategy down the line. This will be important in a second because this was used to determine what part of an implementation research continuum different studies fell into. One thing that's interesting we wanted to code for as well is whether or not within the project descriptions they specified what implementation research framework, model, or theory they might be following. And it's scary to some extent, considering I'm used to seeing this in every grant that I review for the NIH DIRH study section, which is pretty standard that they expect to have some framework, model, or theory that you follow. At least in the project description, only less than 12% or about 12.5% actually stated something. And we gave, again, we were pretty inclusive, gave credit for them saying, we'll use an implementation framework, even if they didn't say what it was. So I don't know what one they're using, if it's someone they made up, whatever. They followed a framework. So that's kind of interesting. Not surprisingly, I think within the HIV world, we do see ADAPT-IT, the CDC's model, used more frequently, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, and RE-AIM, which are very common, are used here. I don't want to get into this, so please don't ask a question about implementation strategies. We found more than 150 different implementation strategies across these 223 studies. It was really challenging to both code as well as understand in many cases what was the strategy they were testing. It often wasn't either specified, clearly labeled, or there was times that the implementation strategy was called the intervention, when in fact it really potentially wasn't. So it was tough to code, but these are the most common ones. You can see here of those 109 unique implementation strategies that we were able to categorize within our implementation research studies. There were 13 looking at care coordination or integration of different care approaches, a lot of them looking at adaptation of the intervention or tailoring of an implementation strategy, providing incentives, using a technology-based delivery, home-based delivery, those kinds of things. In some cases, this was, again, tested against something else. So if you had a clinic-based delivery of testing that you wanted to say, well, if we go to people's homes, is it going to increase the rate? Or are people going to be okay with it? Is there acceptability? That would be potentially just an example of home-based delivery. So those are those. Then there was a whole bunch that had one or two.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Just trying to understand one disconnect. So I thought that only 27% of the studies use an implementation strategy, but we found many more implementation strategies.
Where's the 27%? Where did I say that?
Two slides ago was
That's
this.
fine.
So That would be the sole study aim or stated focus.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
here's another place. Okay.
Yeah, so if you're developing or adapting an implementation strategy, it's included. So yeah, it does pull a lot of pieces of this pie. These are not mutually exclusive or discriminatory from the others.
And before you go on, just a point of clarification.
Yep,
How much of this analysis you said was abstract-based, and was an abstract analysis?
all of it.
Okay.
It's all the project descriptions or project abstracts that are reported in NIH Reporter.
So keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
About theory, et cetera.
Yep. It is the number one thing on the limitations. Not only because it caused me headaches, but because it's real. Okay, so looking back here, okay, so now let's get into outcomes. So we were really interested in figuring out what outcomes are being measured and whether or not they actually are measuring implementation outcomes. So this is where we do see a difference, I think, that's expected for implementation preparation versus the implementation coded studies. So those that are on one side or the other kind of this somewhat arbitrary line that we drew. So looking at preparation, implementation preparation, here's sort of what happens. So about a third of the studies only have one specified implementation outcome in the project description. About half actually have two. And then you can see that 3 or more is a very low percentage. So again, 83% do fall in this either 1 or 2 outcomes range. If you look at what the outcomes actually are that they're measuring, and this is kind of looking across all of them, 56% are looking at some kind of implementation research outcome. 28% are looking at participant impact only. And what I mean by that is really what is the clinical effect on the individual participants within the trial, so the patients. Meaning it's actually, we'll get back to this point in a second, that the trial was actually designed more like a traditional clinical RCT, even though they were actually testing an implementation strategy. Okay? I'll give an example if anyone needs it. But and then we have a number of studies that looked at cost only or looked at participant impact and some kind of cost or a poorly defined implementation outcome. The poorly defined outcomes were things that they just said, we're going to look at implementation process or we're going to look at implementation, which I get, you're getting into the right realm, but at the same token, it was hard to know what exactly you were going to look at and what outcomes you were paying attention to. So again, I'm going to highlight these two kind of chunks here in terms of the 83% versus 17%, because when we look at the implementation trials and the outcomes that they measured, I'm going to jump ahead, we see that there's a much higher proportion that are having more outcomes. They're looking at more implementation outcomes. So further along kind of in the implementation research continuum, starting to focus on more relevant outcomes, which makes a lot of sense, of course. You can see here that this is kind of a weird one, so I'm going to try to explain it as much as I can. 25% of the studies that we characterized as being implementation phase actually only had participant impact. So again, this is a potential study that was designed like a clinical RCT, even though they're testing an implementation strategy and not actually measuring any implementation outcomes. I'm going to beat that horse dead the rest of the talk. So let's look at these, the actual outcomes by phase and what they were measuring instead of just looking at the proportions. So in implementation preparation, not surprisingly, we see that acceptability and feasibility are by far the most commonly measured. There is 13% of the studies had no outcome stated at all, which is kind of interesting. Not even participant impact. I don't know. This is probably a product of the project abstract more than it is anything else, but. And then also we have, looking at participant impact, 21% of the studies had nothing more than participant impact or effectiveness, basically outcomes. When we move over into the implementation, so again, kind of further along, we see a little bit of a switch. So studies are still measuring acceptability and feasibility to some extent, but we see a lot more cost analyses coming in. We see more, we see reach entering the picture a little bit and penetration rates. We start seeing sustainability, which of course, as you'd expect during implementation preparation, people are not measuring sustainability, which you could argue there might be a need to actually do that when you're preparing, but that's not what people are doing. And are measuring now too adoption or uptake of the implementation versus in preparation that was not much of a consideration. So looking at actually the type of study design that they used, we tried to categorize the kind of broad overall type of trial or type of study design. So within the implementation studies, I'm going to flip the script here and go implementation first. We see a lot of RCTs with individual participant assignment, again, so 50%, 57%. We see no formative or observational developmental studies, which is those all fall, thankfully, into our implementation preparation side of the thing here. We see a few cohort longitudinal process studies. We see no modeling studies, which also by definition puts you into the early, the pre-implementation, implementation preparation thing. And here's the thing I really want to point out is Hendricks Brown and David Chambers and a bunch of folks on that annual review paper defined 3 big types of kind of true implementation research studies. One would be a within site comparison, one would be a between site comparison, and one would be a within and between site comparison. And we see those respectively as being 8%, 18%, and 10% of these 108 studies, which really is not that many in the overall scheme of things. But it is, 36% overall. I'm missing a slide, but that's fine. And here's, kind of a really interesting slide. This really gets at the categorization of the implementation continuum. So, we've talked a lot about this implementation preparation phase so far, so I want to tell you exactly what falls into that. 7% of the studies that fell into that were studies that looked at barriers and facilitators only, typically had no actual test of any implementation strategies. 18% were purely developmental studies. So these were pilot studies, adaptation studies, feasibility trials, things where they did not have a fully powered trial of any sort, typically did not compare to anything. So not surprisingly, they're in this implementation preparation. If they actually did a pilot study of some sort where they did a comparison, so pilot RCTs, they fell into this pilot trial thing. 9% of those pilot trials did not have implementation outcomes. And then 13% did have something specified that we could be sure was going to be an implementation outcome. There's also a kind of getting into the implementation. We have it split into 2 different things. So we have strategy effectiveness, which is really a test or a trial of an implementation strategy. So usually only one strategy, often compared to either practice as usual, implementation as usual, or nothing in some cases. But the key distinction is it's not comparing to a second experimental implementation strategy. That would be the comparative effectiveness, which is further along. Under strategy effectiveness, we again divided up into whether or not they had implementation outcomes reported or not. We see about 15% don't say that they're going to do implementation outcomes, and 19% do. And then at the far end, we have comparative implementation. So this is often head-to-head implementation trials where 6% had implementation outcomes, 11% did not, which is kind of interesting. So we'll get into that here in a second when I get to the conclusions. So I just want to highlight these 3 bars, which really, these are the 3 places where there's no implementation outcomes being measured. So what this really means is we looked at their study aims, we looked at their design, we looked at what they were actually calling their independent variable, which we deemed to be an implementation strategy, and we have 40%, 30%-ish of studies that do not have any implementation outcomes stated within their project descriptions. They may be evaluating them. It might be part of AIM 3, AIM 4, who knows, somewhere way down the line that they just didn't include in their abstract, but they were not front and center. I'm going to skip ahead so that we have, or I'm going to just highlight just these couple of things. This is interventions by the implementation research stage. As you can see, PrEP, again, being a newer intervention, a ton of stuff still happening in implementation preparation, a little bit in strategy effectiveness, very little in implementation, comparative implementation. And you can compare this to retention, which has been around. There have been a lot more studies being done for a longer time, a lot more in the comparative implementation, very little in the implementation preparation. This might be of interest to some folks. This is funding by Institute Center and where the continuum falls for those. I'm going to highlight just the 2 that funded the most studies, not because they're doing anything wrong or right, they just funded the most. And I want to point out here that if you look at the average, we're looking at about 60% of the funded studies by NIMH and NIDA, again, our 2 biggest funders, are falling into the implementation preparation side and not the implementation research side. Limitations, again, Paul pointed this out already. All of our coding is based on applicant-provided project descriptions. And if you're like me, it's the last thing you write. You're sleepy. It's the day before it's going to go in. You're just happy to get this thing off your plate. You probably forgot to put that you're evaluating reach as your primary outcome. That's fine. So there may not be sufficient detail, especially of implementation-related variables, in particular because I think a lot of times it could be aim 2 or aim 3. If it's not explicitly an implementation trial, if folks are measuring implementation processes or this is a tertiary kind of outcome, it may be something that they didn't think was central and needed to be included in this description. What this may have led to is actually under-inclusion or potential underestimation of the actual figures, despite our generous coding for implementation characteristics. And we sort of had a generous inclusion criteria to mitigate this, but again, it probably still means we were under-inclusive of some things. There's, of course, a lack of uniformity in abstract content. You would be incredibly surprised, maybe not, that people don't even sometimes say what their aims are in their project description. So it was really hard for us to actually determine what is the point of your study in some cases, let alone what they were going to measure. Some people didn't put their population that they were going to be recruiting. So there were some challenges just purely because we have a limited space. If we had full manuscripts, would not be the same thing. Again, I want to come back to this whole issue of this is stuff that we found in NIH Reporter. There are a couple of CDC-funded studies that popped up in NIH Reporter, but at the same token, it's very clear that this way we did the search does not reflect the universe of HIV research. There's a lot of other studies, a lot of other funders out there, and of course there's people doing unfunded research, or at least not federally funded research, that we would not have had access to. Some conclusions. I think it's pretty clear that implementation research is still emerging in HIV. It is in every field, so that's kind of a no-brainer, but it's really kind of picking up as well as we're kind of getting our heads around it in this field more than maybe some other fields are. The bars around those studies that had no implementation research outcomes, I think is really potential for showing that we have missed opportunities. People are doing implementation research, potentially without even knowing that they're doing implementation research, or they know they're doing it, but they're not measuring outcomes. I don't know what's worse, but either way, there's missed opportunities to gather really good information about implementation that can further either their own work or just contribute to the field in general. And again, I'm going to come back to this too, that there were a lot of studies that we deemed to be implementation research that either were inaccurately designed as an implementation trial and actually couched as a traditional randomized clinical trial. And that might be why they don't have these outcomes. So there may be some issues around that. And I think one thing I also pointed this out too that we struggled a lot with in our coding and trying to make sense of this data is there's a lot of muddiness in what is the implementation strategy versus what is the intervention and what is the thing that you're actually implementing. And I noticed Elvin, I'm going to pick on Elvin because I like him. I know he can take it. He said implementation intervention. Okay? That's one thing that kind of gets muddied in the water is what is the intervention versus what is the strategy. And so sometimes people were saying that we're going to test this intervention around retention. And they would specify two different things that were actually implementation strategies, but they called them interventions, basically did a comparative effectiveness trial design with no implementation outcomes. But the thing they were trying to get people into was an evidence-based intervention that they measured the clinical results of. So you have an implementation trial that's not measuring implementation. And that's a missed opportunity, but also I think could be actually rectified with a little bit better specification and maybe some knowledge. Again, this also, as on the kind of glass half full, there's ample opportunities to expand implementation research in HIV, not only moving forward, but actually in what people potentially are doing right now. So only 9% of all HIV research that we found meets the NIH definition of implementation research and measures implementation research outcomes. That's a pretty small proportion. Half of the studies are in implementation preparation. That's good. That means there's potentially things moving through the pipeline. People are starting to think about it. But one thing that was actually pointed out to me again by David Chambers, who deserves the credit, just because you're doing implementation preparation studies does not mean that that actually ever moves through to implementation research. And it might be because your study didn't actually find anything, but it also might be that that's the end of you don't care. That's the end of what you think is the program of research that you want to do and don't want to get into the messy world of implementation research. Again, beating a dead horse, we need to collect implementation research outcomes. It's not informative to the field of implementation research if you aren't collecting these outcomes, because and especially in cases if you fail. So if you're only measuring clinical effectiveness and you get null results, or you actually get potentially negative results, there's a high potential that it's actually a product of the implementation and not the effectiveness of the intervention. We know that art works, we know that prep works if you get it to people in the right way. The right way is all about implementation. And I think, kind of the final statement here I want to make is that a lot of these problems, or a lot of the shortcomings, or ways to actually address these missed opportunities really potentially just requires a paradigm shift in understanding how to make interventions more effective, or how to make effective interventions work, more so than it is continuing to demonstrate that they work. So that's my thank you.
I think we have time for one or two questions. Anybody has them for JD?
Hi, Paul Gaze, Office of AIDS Research, NIH. First, before my question, Justin, thank you and your team for this good work of piercing the skin, so to speak. And I think this is one of those examples where when you raise more questions than you answer, it's actually a good thing. And I think that's really positive. My question is, of the studies you looked at by abstract analysis, how many were CFAR studies?
So that's a really good question. I don't think that the CFAR.
What's going on with that?
I don't think the CFAR grants themselves, like the actual CFAR centers, were included in any of it. So they should not have been in there. Those that are funded or supported by CFAR researchers is a different question.
But it may be, I raised that as it may be yet something for you to look at.
Absolutely.
And the other thing has to do with, in terms of more the deep dive of how things get coded as HIV-related research, and Chris and I are going to talk about that a bit more, and that you can have high-quality research, and there's implementation research at NIH that may be that in that formative step that may not be coded as AIDS, but it's AIDS-related in the sense that it's building a base for the research to come.
That's actually one thing that, is not part of my conclusions, but something in more of a big picture of implementation science is not having our distinct fields get siloed. And so actually learning from drug abuse research, learning from behavioral interventions for mental health, for obesity, for health promotion, because those effective strategies that we identify in those fields can actually translate to what we're doing in HIV, especially in other areas of infectious disease. We saw a lot of studies that were looking at other infectious diseases, and some of the cohorts that actually had folks with HIV included in it, but it wasn't the primary target population, so it did not get included in the HIV-related research. So that's a really good point. Really, we are kind of, in this case, looking at that silo.
Jade, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Steph has it. No, pass it on, Steph.
Yeah. So one of the things that Elvin and I were trying to do a review over the last year to try to kind of show the relevance of implementation research within and its relationship with impact. Mm-hmm. And so we had this little, this tete-a-tete just now about this like large RCTs, no clear implementation frameworks, one could argue for a number of them, and no impact. Is there a relationship? And I think part of this also is like investigators have to feel convinced that there's value in having clear frameworks and including these indicators, that there's some connection then ultimately to like the impact of the work we're doing. Many of us in this room, are convinced, but the question I have is really like, and maybe it's part of what tomorrow's about and sort of moving forward, is like how do we sell that in a more meaningful way so that folks get that clear connection between the inclusion of these metrics and methods and frameworks and ultimately the impact of the things that we're trying to show for the patients we aim to serve. So,
I know one thing that's going to drive people following theories, frameworks, models is review panels. So one of the things that's sort of a little bit interesting, but I think in some ways shows why maybe we're not as far along as we are in that uniformity, is the number of special emphasis panels that have reviewed these grants, 60%. Which we know come from lots of different researchers from lots of different backgrounds. Often, those people come and go off those panels very quickly, so there's less of a culture than an established study section. One change that happened this year is the DIRH, the Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health Study section at NIH, now can take HIV-related research. So it used to be if you were deemed an HIV/AIDS application, it would never go there. Even if you wanted it to, it would not go there. In that study section, it has basically become mandatory that you say what your framework is, what your theory is, and you will get dinged pretty hard if you don't have it. With that expectation and a lot more implementation research grants in HIV actually going to that study section, people kind of understanding that or expecting it, it's going to push people to do it. Whether there's value in it is a whole different question, but certainly those expectations, and I think if the field can come around some kind of a consensus about what we want to do in that area, it will help. So we do have some convincing to do around the value. But
I have the mic now. Two related questions. Is this published? Is the first one. And the second one, is there a desire or a plan among your team to do a similar review, but of peer-reviewed publications?
Yes, no, and yes. The no is, it will be though. We are planning to submit it for publication, hopefully before the end of the calendar year. And yes, we are planning to try to find some funding to look at published. The reason we actually went with NIH Reporter versus published is the lag time. So a study that's coming out with its primary implementation outcomes now was likely funded or at least started 7 or 8 years ago. So even the database that we have now, a lot of those studies from even 2013, their primary outcome papers aren't published. So that was the reason we went there first. But yes, we do plan to do that.
Hi, I just want to push back a little against what I see as not even creeping, but galloping orthodoxy and this slavish devotion to frameworks that are, fairly limited. And I think there's a lot of implementation research and and a lot of research that has informed implementation strategies. And I think that walling off this area and trying to define it, according to a set of rules that you have to, I really worry here about study sections that have, rigid rules. And if you don't mention the consolidated framework for implementation research in the first paragraph, you're out. And I just think that's orthodoxy that is going to hinder the field, and that you shouldn't restrict research, with these artificial frameworks that somebody invented, a few years ago, and will be obsolete in a few more years. So I don't have anything against them, but I think enforcing them as rules and guidelines and approaching this field as you have to fit within our definitions or you're not part of it is just a big mistake in the wrong direction.
I would draw an analogy to behavioral intervention science, which basically is if you don't have a model of behavior change theory, whatever model you choose, then you don't have a clear rationale for why you're doing your study at all. And that was something that came forward over the last 15, 20 years in psychology and in other health promotion activities. That's expected in that field too. It's really similar here. There's no dogma around you have to say CFR, you have to use EPIS, but you have to have something. There has to be some kind of guiding framework to why you're doing what you're doing, why you've picked the implementation outcomes that you have. And honestly, it really helps reviewers. It's not an implicit, communication that you've read the literature and know what you're doing, but it helps have an organization for a reviewer to go through and say, okay, here's why they're doing what they're doing and how things flow. So I think it's there is challenges. I don't think we ever want to get into a place where it says you have to do this if you're doing this. That's just that's not going to help science in any way. But I think people do sometimes, and implementation has been maybe worse in some areas than this, of grants coming across and the projects being kind of willy-nilly, at least 5 or 10 years ago when this field started. So we could have a good debate about it, I think, but I don't totally disagree with you.
And we will have more debate.
Yeah, we'll debate more. Last one.
This is thanks for a great talk, JD. This is I think related to the conversation that you're having with Dick. So how do you and how does the study section sort of perceive I guess like the boundaries of what those frameworks are, right? So many of these implementation sort of frameworks obviously draw on larger traditions in social sciences, like sociology and economics and stuff like that. And so, like there are a lot of ways of looking at the behavior of systems or organizations or people that are not named as an implementation science framework.
Yeah.
How did you sort of code them here, and also how do you see people perceiving those approaches?
Yeah. So that's a really
behavioral
good point.
economics being
There's a great paper in implementation science from 2015 by Per Nilsen, Nilsen, and he specified 5 things. One was theory. Actually, there's 2 different kinds of theories. One's frameworks, models, et cetera. So the important thing, back to your point, is there are implementation-specific models and theories, and there are general models and theories. So you could use a theory of organizational behavior change or a theory of individual behavior change that comes from a completely different field outside implementation, and that would be completely acceptable. And you wouldn't have to also have an implementation science framework in addition to that other, maybe psychology-based behavior change framework. But it really is sort of, there really has to be some kind of guidance behind why you've designed a study the way you have, why you think your strategy is going to work the way that it does.
I mean, it's good to hear that the boundaries are somewhat fluid. I mean, as you know, before Pierre's paper, Trish Greenhalgh did this sort of review of innovations in healthcare delivery settings. And, in that paper, one thing that's sort of interesting, that's sort of missing, is she draws from like agriculture, but economics is not in it. And so, you wonder, did somebody sort of draw an arbitrary line and say these count and these don't?
And honestly, some of the coolest things that have come out are from like behavioral economics, from system science, from engineering, from things that did not originate in medicine at all.
So it's good to keep those boundaries fluid.
Thanks, AD. Mine's a simple question. So, I mean, you did harp on how there were many examples of implementation research that didn't use an implementation research outcome, and so I know you might have it at your fingertips, but what were the outcomes, if not some of these outcomes that are related to implementation?
Predominantly just clinical outcomes.
Like, for example, like mortality or?
Or incidence rates. I mean, just your standard stuff that you'd see in any RCT testing prep or testing, linkage potentially is how many people got services and what did they get new incidence rates if they were HIV negative to begin with. Which is not there's a whole class of hybrid trials that I know, probably everyone is aware of, where you look at implementation and effectiveness. So it's not like you can't do that. It's when your trial design is really testing an implementation strategy, where yes, it could have a downstream effect on the clinical outcomes, but there's a huge intermediary step of the implementation outcomes that really are a mediator. So if you have poor fidelity, if you have poor reach, poor acceptability, that's going to translate into your clinical effects. It's great if you have a significant impact and it's in the right direction. What happens if it goes in the wrong direction? You have null effects. It's probably the implementation outcomes or variability within those that actually led to the differences.
I mean, I think we sometimes have the same problem in RCTs, in traditional RCTs. Often it's because it's a black box of what's going on between the intervention and the outcome. But I guess you're making the point that in the case of these studies, we do have a theory about how this is supposed to work, and we should be measuring along that sort of pathway.
I think so, in general. I would agree with that.
I mean, one thing I just keep wondering when I'm hearing this is that really that people aren't putting the thought into either measuring this or even putting it in the abstract because they were too sleepy or just oversight, or is it actually that it was intentional, that we've been told that NIH doesn't value implementation science research and we've intentionally sort of buried it, and it's actually in the grant if you get there, but that this is just a very intentional selection bias.
Yeah, I think there's a hodgepodge of probably the reasons for it. I think that's definitely a legitimate reason that probably does represent a handful of those. There's also the other legitimate thing that I've had people do research and present on their stuff, and I've gone up and said, hey, that was really awesome. Why didn't you measure implementation research? Well, it's not implementation research. I was like, yeah, it is. And I kind of, I was all excited. They were like, oh my God, I didn't really know I was doing implementation research. It really was like a dawning of like, oh man, I'm like so stuck, or I've only learned how to do clinical trials, that every time they design something, it's a clinical trial-based design, even if it actually is an implementation research question and an implementation strategy that they're testing. So I think there is a little bit of both, and there's potential education that goes into the latter. The former, I think, is more a study section, potentially an RFA or PAR related issue as well. But yeah, you're right. There's many reasons probably for that bucket.